What does reciprocal mean? Reciprocal just means you switch the numerator and denominator of a fraction. So what's the reciprocal of 2? It's going to be 1 over 2. Why? Because 2 is the same as 2 over 1. And if I switch the numerator and the denominator, then I get 1/2, right? But please don't confuse reciprocal with opposite. What is the opposite of 2? -2. So notice how the reciprocal of 2 is not equal to the opposite of 2. So opposite and reciprocal are not the same thing. So what if I asked you, what's the opposite reciprocal of 2? You would actually do two things. Number one, you would change the sign. So the positive number becomes a negative. And you would also switch the numerator and denominator. So these two are opposite reciprocals, but they are not reciprocals. The reciprocal of 2 is 1/2, and the opposite of 2 is -2. Do not confuse opposite with reciprocal. What if I gave you a negative number and I said, what's the reciprocal of this negative number? So what's the reciprocal of -2? Again, it does not mean change the sign. So if you start with a negative number, you're going to end with a negative number. And if you switch the numerator and denominator, you're going to get -1/2. Again, notice how the sign did not change. So what's the reciprocal of 2/3? It's going to be 3 over 2. Again, the signs did not change. What's the reciprocal of -2 over 3? That's going to be -3 over 2. Again, the signs did not change. What's the reciprocal of 1? It's actually 1. So why? Well, 1 is the same as 1 divided by 1, right? And if you take the reciprocal of that, what do you get? 1 over 1. So in this case, the reciprocal and the original number are equal, but that's not always going to be the case, right? So if we go back to 2, what's the reciprocal of 2? 1 over 2 or 1/2, so 2 and 1/2 are not the same, right? But what's the reciprocal of -1? It's actually going to be -1. Why? Because -1 is the same as -1 over 1, which would be the same as, if I take the reciprocal of that, I get 1 over -1, which is still equal to -1. So is it true that sometimes reciprocal is equal to the original? Yes, but that's not always the case, and you cannot assume that. What's the reciprocal of 0? Well, 0 is the same as 0 over 1, so the reciprocal of 0 would be 1 over 0, which is actually undefined because you cannot divide by 0. So in this case, there is no numerical answer. Although if you were to ask, or the question was to ask, what's the reciprocal of undefined, it would actually be 0. So 0 and undefined are reciprocals of each other, but again, they're not equal to each other, and understand that undefined is not a numerical answer. It just means you cannot do that operation. So to summarize, reciprocal means you switch the numerator and denominator of a fraction. So the reciprocal of a over b would be b over a, but also remember that a number and its reciprocal are not necessarily equal, although sometimes they can be, specifically in the examples of 1 and -1. And finally, reciprocal does not mean opposite. So if you take the reciprocal of a positive number, it's still going to be positive. If you take the reciprocal of a negative number, it's still going to be negative.